I wasn't supposed to find the room. If I had just watered the plants like my neighbor asked, none of this would have happened. But 3 weeks after he left town, I dropped his watering can, and when I bent down to grab it, I noticed something behind the bookshelf that definitely wasn't supposed to be there. And once I opened it, I realized my neighbor wasn't just some quiet guy who liked gardening. He had been watching all of us. So for context, I live in a pretty normal apartment building. Nothing fancy. 4 floors, maybe 20 units total. The kind of place where you recognize people in the hallway but don't really know them. My neighbor, Greg, lived directly across from me. Greg was quiet, like really quiet, not creepy quiet, just the type of guy who kept to himself. Mid-40s maybe, worked from home, always polite when we crossed paths. We had maybe 5 conversations in the entire year I'd lived there. But about a month ago he knocked on my door, and that alone was unusual. When I opened it, he was holding a small set of keys and looked kind of nervous. He said, "Hey, sorry to bother you. I'm leaving town for a few weeks and I was wondering if you could do me a favor." I figured he needed his mail grabbed or something. Instead, he asked if I could water his plants once a week. Now normally I'd say no to something like that, but he offered me $100 for the month, and honestly the plants looked pretty easy to take care of. So I said sure. He gave me the key, showed me where the watering can was, and pointed out the plants around the apartment. There were a lot of them, like 20 at least. Some big ones by the windows, smaller ones on shelves. The place smelled like soil and fertilizer. But everything else in the apartment was surprisingly minimal. Bare walls, basic furniture, almost no decorations, which I remember thinking was kind of strange considering how much he cared about the plants. Before he left, he said one more thing that stuck with me. He pointed at the hallway leading to his bedroom and said, "Just water the plants in the living room and kitchen. The ones in the back room don't need anything." At the time I didn't think much about it. People have private spaces. Totally normal. So the first 2 weeks went exactly how you'd expect. I'd unlock the door, water the plants, maybe be inside 5 minutes, then leave. Nothing weird. But during the 3rd week, something small happened that ended up changing everything. I was watering the plants near his bookshelf when the watering can slipped out of my hand. It hit the floor and rolled under the shelf. Annoying, but whatever. So I crouched down to grab it. And that's when I noticed the gap. Behind the bookshelf, there was space. Not much, maybe a couple inches, but enough to see that the shelf wasn't actually against the wall. Which was weird because it looked built in. Out of curiosity I pushed the shelf slightly. And it moved. Just a little. At that moment I remember thinking, okay, that's odd. But I also told myself it probably wasn't a big deal. Maybe the shelf was loose or something. Still, curiosity got the better of me. So I pushed it again. And this time it slid about an inch to the side. That's when my stomach dropped. Because behind it, I could see the outline of a door. A hidden door. Now look, I know what you're probably thinking. Just leave. None of your business. And honestly that's exactly what I should have done. But when you discover something like that in real life, it's almost impossible to ignore. So I stood there for a second debating with myself. Then I slid the bookshelf a little further. And the door opened. Inside was a small room. Completely dark. At first I thought maybe it was just a storage space. But when I flipped the light switch, I realized that wasn't even close. The room was filled with computer monitors. Like, at least 8 of them. All mounted on a long desk against the wall. And every single one of them was showing security camera footage. From inside our building, I immediately recognized the lobby. Another screen showed the parking lot. Another one showed the hallway outside my apartment. I just stood there staring, trying to process what I was seeing. Because this wasn't like a normal home security setup. There were wires everywhere, recording equipment, hard drives stacked on the desk. And then I noticed something that made things even worse. One of the monitors wasn't showing the building. It was showing inside someone's apartment. Not clearly, but through a window from across the courtyard. My heart started racing, because suddenly I realized what this was. Greg had been watching the entire building. For who knows how long. I stepped closer to the desk and saw folders on the computer labeled by apartment numbers. One of them was my unit number. That's when I felt this cold wave of panic. Because I had no idea how much he had on me. Photos, videos, God knows what else. I backed out of the room immediately, closed the door, and pushed the bookshelf back exactly how it was. Then I left the apartment. I remember locking the door and just standing in the hallway for a minute trying to calm down. Part of me wondered if I was overreacting. Maybe there was some explanation. But the more I thought about it, the worse it seemed. Why would someone need surveillance footage of their neighbor's windows? Why were there folders labeled by apartment numbers? And why hide the entire setup behind a secret door? So I went back into my apartment and started looking Greg up online. And that's when things got even weirder. Because I couldn't find anything. No LinkedIn, no social media, no record of where he worked. It was like the guy barely existed online. At that point I knew I couldn't just ignore it. But I also didn't want to accuse someone of something insane without proof. So I decided to talk to the building manager. I explained what I'd found and honestly expected him to laugh it off. But when I mentioned Greg's apartment number, his reaction changed instantly. He got really quiet. Then he asked me, "You're sure you saw cameras?" I said yes, multiple ones. That's when he told me something that made the entire situation 10 times worse. Apparently over the past year, several tenants had complained about feeling like they were being watched. One woman said she kept noticing someone standing at the window of Greg's apartment with binoculars. But there was never enough evidence to do anything about it. Until now, within about 30 minutes the building manager had called the police. I showed them the key Greg had given me and explained everything. And eventually they decided to go into the apartment. Watching them slide the bookshelf open was surreal, like I was in some kind of movie. But once they saw the room, their expressions immediately changed. One of the officers just said, "Yeah, this is bad." They started going through the computers and equipment while another officer asked me questions. And the more they looked, the more serious it seemed. They found years of recordings, thousands of files, different apartments, different tenants, some taken through windows, some from hidden cameras outside the building. I felt sick thinking about how long it had been going on. Eventually one of the detectives came out of the room and asked if Greg was supposed to be back soon. I told him I thought he said 3 or 4 weeks, which meant he could show up any day. And that's exactly what happened. 2 days later, I got home from work and saw 3 police cars outside our building. Greg had come back. According to the building manager, he walked in like nothing was wrong. Until he saw the officers waiting for him in the lobby. They arrested him on the spot. Turns out he'd been secretly recording people for years across multiple buildings he'd lived in. Our apartment complex was just the latest one. And if I hadn't dropped that stupid watering can, we might have never found the room. Sometimes I still think about how close I came to just ignoring it. If I hadn't bent down at the right angle, if I hadn't pushed that shelf, everyone in the building would still have no idea someone was watching them. And the creepiest part? My apartment window was directly across from his. Meaning that for the entire year I lived there, there's a very good chance Greg had been watching me too.